Hello, I'm Michael Holmes, and today it's my great pleasure to speak to Sidita Kushi. Uh, Sidita, you are Assistant Professor of Politics at Mount Holyoke College, that's in Massachusetts. Most importantly, in my opinion, you are author of Dying by the Sword, the Militarization of U.S. Foreign Policy, together with Monica Toft. I think this is an extremely important book. I would put it this way. It's the most important statistical analysis of US foreign policy from the founding of the nation, like its War of Independence against the British in 1776, until today,
Mhm.
because it's based on the most comprehensive data set there is on US foreign policy, or mainly US military intervention, I should say, to be correct. Your latest book is actually called From Kosovo to Darfur. That is about humanitarian interventions. I haven't read it, can't say anything about it. First of all, Dying by the Sword is an absolute must-read for anyone interested in US foreign policy or Western foreign policy in general. And let's jump right in. Could you please give us a brief overview of your data set?
Mhm.
How you were also the director, I think, of that data set. And
Mhm.
how did you collect this data? And what are your most important findings?
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure, and I really look forward to this discussion. So, regarding the data set is a product of a very wonderful, a relatively large team that include Monica Toft, myself, of course, and about 15 graduate students at the Fletcher School at Tufts University over 2 to 3 years. The main
Mhm,
purpose of this dataset project, the Military Intervention Project, was to attempt to find every single case of the U.S. threat, display, or usage of force all the way until war across the history of the country.
mhm,
We realized that other data sets existed and they were quite good. And we, of course, relied heavily on those data sets in populating our case universe. However, some of these other existing data sets only followed US military interventions up until World War II and maybe
mhm.
starting in the early 1900s. Others
Yeah.
focused only on the big interventions, so only boots on the ground and did not include other types of interventions. And then there were data sets where, while the vast majority of components were wonderful, they did not look at the smaller bits of displays or threats of force that we believe should populate this military interventionism universe. We were hoping to also create a data set where other scholars, practitioners, or journalists could pick and choose the kind of military intervention definition they were interested in using. So if you
Mhm,
are to download our data set, which is publicly available from the 1700s until 2019, you will be able to pull a specific definition of US intervention you want. Do you want
mhm,
boots on the ground? Do you want over 10,000 deaths as per the intervention outcome? Or do
mhm,
you want the threats or displays of force? We also have a separate data set on drone warfare. And we
mhm,
also have a separate data set that we are thankful to our political science colleagues for on the US frontier wars. So we
mhm,
wanted to provide more nuance to US military interventions across time and place. And the main impetus for this was actually Monica's curiosity within her thesis of kinetic diplomacy.
mhm,
She was very interested to see whether the US had grown more militaristic since the end of the Cold War, and particularly since 9/11, because anecdotally, she was seeing this pattern and she was writing about it in the framework of kinetic diplomacy. But we didn't have a systematic way of showcasing it just yet.
mhm,
So this data set was an effort to collect every single academically confirmable threat, display, and usage of force by the United States across time. And we think we've gotten closer to it. We'll
mhm,
talk later, I'm sure, about some of the data limitations and some of the aspirations that we have for the future. But the way that we collected it, in short, is through the help of our research team. We started off with everything that already existed. So the MID data set, the International Military Intervention data set, the Correlates of War data sets, the Congressional Research Service, U.S. usage of force lists, everything that we could find. We ended up having over 100 of these kind of ad hoc sources. And then we created our initial case universe. We also looked at naval records and Air Force records in some of the archives we were able to pull. At the very beginning of the project, we ended up with over 600 cases of traditional intervention. And then
Wow.
the second half of the project, we backlogged. So we looked at every single data point we collected from other sources, and we attempted to confirm the intervention details through at least three separate legitimate sources, so academic or
Mhm.
scholarly journalism. If we could not confirm across three sources, we removed the case from our data set. You'll still find it in our code book with an explanation as to why it's removed. So if someone is less interested in being very certain, they can still rely on that case as a possible case of U.S. intervention. But if they want the conservative estimates of U.S. military intervention, they have that in the finalized data set. And then I
Mhm.
personally went through, and once we backlogged our case universe of military interventions, I collected about 200 variables on whether the intervention was for regime change purposes or whether it was social protection. So the objectives of the intervention, the outcomes in terms of dollar costs, in terms of casualties across both sides, and then how they connected to U.S. national interests. So whether the target state was contiguous to the US, whether it was a formal colonial relationship, whether there were existing alliances between the target state and the US, oil resources, other natural resources, and I created an intervention national interest index. So how high were US interests within this particular target state? And is there a temporal and historical correlation between the frequency and rate of US interventionism and its national interests within that particular part of the world? So we
Mhm.
collected over 200 separate variables related to each intervention on intervention causes, consequences for both the US and the world at large. And we are still starting to dip into some of that data for analysis. So the book was the overarching pattern-driven foray into the data set, and each data point also comes with its own case study. So not only do you have the statistical universe, but for those interested in learning more about every single case, like the quasi-wars, which is our first data point, you can read a 2 to 3 page summary that
Mhm.
details what happens, why the literature claims it happened, the definitional problems we might have encountered, start and end dates, as well as more resources you can dive into if that specific case study is the one that interests you. And we did this because we very quickly realized that the American public seems to have very little knowledge of what is currently happening in terms of US special operations, that the US executive branch simply tells Congress on record that we are deploying additional troops here. And it is a very small tagline in the grand
Mhm.
report. And unless someone digs into it intentionally and consistently for a long time, very few of us, myself and Monica included, have been aware of these smaller operations, the smaller military missions that ultimately tend to grow into larger ones, even if they remain on the periphery of US foreign policy. I hope that helps get us started.
Yes. So, I hope our listeners are convinced that this is like the number one data set on U.S. military interventions there is. It's very scientific. It's, um, like its methodology is very rigorous. So I guess some of the numbers, especially on the total number of
Mhm.
interventions, seem to be actually be conservative numbers. But let's jump into the most important findings now.
Yes, so our most important findings. So we generally find that While there is a narrative that claims the US was isolationist up until World War II or, up until the 1900s more broadly, we don't completely disagree with that narrative.
Hmm.
However, we think that that narrative discounts many of the internal interventions the US waged in the 1800s up until the early 1900s. And we do argue that it discounts some of the US military interventions in the Pacific. So while traditional interventions, as we currently understand them between a modern nation state and another nation state, those dramatically increased in the 1900s, we find over and over again that in the 1800s, the US was waging thousands of disputes and militarized conflicts against over 100 American Indian nations. And we believe it to be a relatively false narrative to claim the US was an isolationist country in the 1800s and early 1900s, simply because it did not engage outside of the continent. But it did, however, engage militaristically within the continent from east to west, and it did engage militaristically in the Pacific as well as into Latin America, which, of course, it extended its militaristic forays by the late 1800s and 1900s after the Spanish-American War. So that's one of our findings. Another one of our findings that in terms of US military interventions within the state system more traditionally, we find that the US grew militaristically after World War II, which is a standard perception for the most part. However, um, apologies about the sound in the background. Do you mind if I close my window very quickly?
It's not necessary. It's not loud, but you can if you
Oh,
want. Sure.
all right. You do that. Thank you.
Mhm.
So in terms of more traditional interventions, the standard accounts tend to agree that they really increased in frequency and rate after World War II when the US took on a more standardized global leadership role and when it became a superpower alongside the Soviet Union. So we
Hmm.
find the Cold War had the highest frequency of US military interventions, which is generally to be expected given the rivalry and the bipolar order. What took us by surprise, however, is that the post-Cold War era had the highest rate of US military interventions.
Mm.
And that is really the most important because the Cold War era spanned across many more years than the post-Cold War era. So the only way to really balance that temporal effect is by calculating the rate of interventionism per year, not necessarily the total number of US military interventions per year. So, to keep it simple, we generally find that during the Cold War era, the US intervened about about 2 times per year on average.
Hmm.
And then in the post-Cold War era, it seems to jump to about 4 times per year. So it's an
Mm.
almost 50% increase in its intervention rate, which is
Wow.
surprising given that the post-Cold War era found the US without a rival power.
Hmm.
It was no longer threatened existentially. There was
No.
no direct, distinct fear of US security domestically and even regionally being impacted. So we find also that this jump in intervention frequency in the post-Cold War era seems to also parallel decreased US national interests, at least geopolitical interests within the target states. And in the post-Cold War era, the US also seems to have more frequently intervened as a third party disputant, not
Hmm.
as the initial original disputants in a conflict that led to intervention. So we see a shift in US national interest definitions in an era when the US does not have a natural rival as it once did during the Cold War. So that very much surprised us. Maybe it should not have, given
Hmm.
the current events of the day since 9/11, and we then began attempted to explain it. So in the book itself, we don't spend too much time trying to do the cause and effect analysis. We don't conclude with one particular factor that is driving this era distinction,
Hmm.
but we do have ongoing research, some that have been recently published, on the role of unipolarity in shifting how a hegemon uses its military force. And we generally tend to find similar things, that a relatively unipolar system seems to prod its hegemon into waging more military interventions as opposed to the bipolar system that preceded it. So, in sum, we generally find the US seems to be waging higher rates of intervention in all parts of the world, right? It
Hmm.
started as a regional hegemon, generally intervening in within its own neighborhood, within Latin America, within the Pacific, rarely within Europe in proxy conflicts. And then after World War II, and especially after 9/11, if you look at some of our graphs, they light up in all sorts of colors. The US is intervening in sub-Saharan Africa for the first time really within this era. It's intervening in the Middle East, of course, and North Africa, South Asia. It is intervening in all parts of the world. So
Hmm.
it's this very clear trajectory of when it was a regional hegemon, it waged military interventions within that sphere of influence. When it grew into a bipolar power and then possibly a unipolar one, it militaristically intervened everywhere. And for lower national interests, at least according to our geopolitically oriented index and measurement of national interest. And now mainly as a third party actor within existing disputes. And before I wrap up this answer, we do find that US highest hostility rates within each of these interventions seem to have grown relative to state B, which is the
Hmm.
other member of the dispute, if you will. So in the post-Cold War era, the US has increased its hostility levels relative to the disputant, whereas the disputant seems to have lowered their hostility levels. So you end up with a little bit of a hostility gap. And
Hmm.
that gap had seemed to have equalized during the Cold War, but it is no longer equalized according to some of our findings.
So this may be a bit confusing by now for our listeners if they haven't read the book. But I hope they're already excited and gonna buy the book right now. Um, First of all, we both haven't mentioned the total number of military interventions by the United States. It's close to 400. Is it
Correct.
392 or something?
393.
Okay, I was wrong by one. Uh,
Yeah, it's almost 400, and it is a conservative estimate because it doesn't include those unclear cases. It doesn't include many drone strikes, and it doesn't include the frontier wars.
okay, but on the other hand, we should mention that half of those were just displays and threats of force. So it wasn't really a war in that sense.
Exactly. So we don't
Yeah,
see outright war too frequently in our data set. We do
yeah.
see about 50% of usage of force. But yes, about half of them are not usage of force just yet, but it would still be an intervention. So we thought it was important to trace that escalation as
Hmm.
well as the direct usage of force and outright war.
So when I was reading the book, I was thinking like, if somebody is like um, somebody is defending the US empire and saying, well, of course, I mean, because some of them are honest and smart and they say, well, of course, the US has done wrong things, like all nations have done terrible crimes. But overall, the US empire has done more good than bad. They usually point to the fact that the world has been most peaceful since 1945, and I think that's a fact. And they point out that, well, that's the era of the US being the global hegemon. So they say it was largely beneficial to the world. Um, so they could read your book, I think, and still keep to that belief, even so it would be much harder. So I would
Mhm.
like to discuss a little bit what of your findings really point to the fact that most of these military interventions did far more bad than good. I think we should be open-minded that some of them probably did some
Yes.
good, especially, of course, World War II in
Yes.
Germany. So it's even more important to point that out. But it's actually hard to find that many where you would say they clearly did a lot of did more good than harm, I think. But you already, first of all, you already pointed out that when there was no major, um, when there was no comparative threat, no other great power that was threatening Western hegemony in any serious way, like the Soviet Union, the US actually increased its level of hostility and its level of intervention. So that's a first hint that, that sounds weird. If we would really be about peace and stability in the world, then we should actually decrease that when there is less of a threat, but we didn't.
Mhm.
More importantly, I think one of the most important findings is you already mentioned it, but I want to go in a bit more detail. And that is you did a comparison of the hostility levels
Mhm.
of the United States and its adversaries through the whole time period, the last 250 years, basically. And there's a great graph in the book, and what it basically shows, correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I saw that until the Cold War, the US was had a far higher hostility level than its enemies, usually around 50% higher, something like that. So significantly higher. During the Cold War, it was about the same, which to me makes sense because the US and the Soviet Union were sort of like always at each other's throats. And if you look at the most important conflicts at the time, you see that both sides and their proxy allies did a lot of bad shit. Sometimes one side was a bit worse, but then it was the other side. And I would not say the Soviet Union was worse than the U.S. I think they was about the same. Of course, the U.S. system, I would prefer to live in the U.S. or in West Germany than Soviet Union or East Germany, but that's about internal problems, not about the foreign policy. We should not confuse the two. And then afterwards, so during the Cold War, it's about the same. And afterwards, the hostility levels of the US are, as before the Cold War, are
Mhm.
higher again and
Mhm.
increasingly higher. So is that basically correct?
Yes, yes, I think that would be a correct assessment of that hostilities gap that I mentioned earlier. That is indeed correct.
Can you explain a little bit?
Yes. So I was not surprised to see that the hostility levels had equalized during the Cold War either. Clearly, the US was being restrained by the rival power. And I would also argue that part of the reason you see a higher hostilities level after the end of the Cold War is that US military adventurism did not incur a very, very high cost or backlash from other global actors. So if we instead lived in a post Cold War era where the US was being challenged very, very seriously by other rising hegemons at the time, like China, or
Mhm,
maybe a coalition of Latin American countries, or India, which did not happen, of course, then I would expect the US to constrain its foreign policy because whether it wanted to wage interventions or not, it would have been aware that a mistake might have cost it more of its power, more of its economic resources, and so on. And had the US waged a military intervention that failed horrifically during an era of great power rivalries, then that would have limited its next steps
mhm,
simply because of the fact that security was on the line. The fact that the US had no natural rival at that point in time, I believe, allowed it to grow more adventuristic in its military forays. It also did not help that after the end of the Cold War, US political elites struggled to formulate a new grand strategic vision. What was the US's role in the world? What were our national interests now? How were we hoping to pursue them? Should the US do what is good for its own security, or should it do what is good for the world? And for a while there, with some back and forth based on presidential administrations, we decided that we would do, and I quote, what is good for the world. And we would take on the role of global policemen. We would interfere and intervene within civil wars, civil crises, sometimes to positive outcomes, sometimes to negative outcomes that echoed across the next case. But we expanded our national interests through a very moralistic lens. And I
mhm,
think we don't talk as much about this in the book, but I think it is important to mention here that all throughout U.S. political history, there has been this vein of American exceptionalism, this public and politically elite belief that when the U.S. uses its military might, it is not an imperialist power. It is
Mhm.
doing so for moral, ethical reasons. And I think a lot of this arose from the early days of the US, where the fact that its geography kept it from involving itself in European affairs, it created this image in the population that the US is not aggressive. The US is a restrained foreign policy actor. And when it does use its military, it only does it for the right or prudent reasons. So this is the narrative that formed, and I think never truly went away until possibly more recently. So when the US uses its military, it does it because it needs to, or it does it for the
Mhm.
good of others. And that can be very dangerous because it completely erodes the basis of what generally is the national interest.
Mhm.
So we don't foray so much into whether the US military interventions were better or worse for the world in our book, but
Mhm.
we do narrow the scope to have these US military interventions been beneficial for US national interests? So have
Mhm.
they been good for the US even? And we
Mhm.
generally formulate the argument that not in the past decades. These
Mhm.
interventions seem to respond to lower national interests. The US public does not seem to want the US involved in many parts of these interventions. They don't have the political will.
Mhm.
And a lot of these interventions are shadowy, gray zone kind of conflicts with very little accountability and transparency. The link between Congress and US public opinion seems to have shattered, if it ever existed.
Mhm.
And more than that, I would argue that the US has lost soft power legitimacy. And with a loss of diplomatic power, with the loss of soft power, it actually creates this vicious cycle internally where it has to rely on more military force to get what it wants.
Mhm.
So for the US, we have generally presented the argument that it has, throughout these last few decades, relied too much on military force as a tool of statecraft, and it has allowed the erosion and the hollowing of other tools of statecraft, like economics, like diplomacy. And if this trend continues, you will create that self-fulfilling prophecy where if all you have is a hammer, everything you see in the world looks like a nail. And with the world order now looking much closer to a multipolar one, the US will not be able to afford the same level of military adventurism. And it would be detrimental to itself. It would also
Mhm.
most likely be detrimental to global stability in a shifting landscape. But I will end with this reminder to those who might read the book and say, well, the US has done some good. We don't disagree with that premise.
Right.
I speak for Monica as well when I say that we do not argue that the US should never use military force. We are arguing for a tempering of that tool relative to
Right.
others. So diplomacy first, and then military as a last resort. And we also want to remind our readers that we understand the limits of our data. It
Mhm.
only measures the US against itself. So we
Mhm.
are only following US military trends relative to itself in different historical eras. So unfortunately, our data can't say too much about whether the US is more or less militaristic than other great powers across history. We don't
Mhm.
have that comparative data set solidified yet, where we can see whether the US is using military might more than the Soviet Union did, or more than Britain did back in its heyday. If we did have access to those comparative data points, we could make greater claims about, wait, is the US exceptional or unique in the way that it wields its military might? Or does this all boil down to power? And the more powerful you are, the more you use military force to get what you want, and the more imperialist your foreign policy becomes, right? Harkening all the way
Mhm.
back to the Athenian expedition and so on. Are these similar historical echoes, or is the US unique here in some way? And we are on our way to trying to answer that question, but we have not gotten there yet.
There's another great analysis in the book about how often the U.S. intervened in different countries, and
Mhm,
the findings are very telling. This is really important to take a look at that,
mhm,
because there is a big, let's say, correlation that is can't hardly be just a coincidence, that the same countries that the US intervened in the most are the countries that it's like in a conflict with today. And so I would just like to read the top 7 countries in which the US, according to your analysis, intervened the
mhm.
most. Okay. So
Yes.
that is China in that order: China, Russia, Mexico, North Korea,
Mhm,
Cuba, Iran, and Nicaragua. I visited most of these countries, and in all of these countries, the people remember all the things that US have done to them. By the way, in most of these countries, other Western powers or also other powers have done even worse things than the US. It depends on the country. Like in China, of course, Japan and Britain also, and France. In Russia, of course, Germany mostly, and France also. In Mexico, Spain, North Korea, well, South Korea, I guess, and but the US, and then Cuba, Spain and the US, Iran, Russia, Britain and the US, and
mhm.
Saudi Arabia, I think they would say, and Nicaragua, also Spain and the United States. So it's I'm pretty sure it's hard to prove, but first of all, I think the main reason why there is a conflict today, all these hostilities with the United States, is that history, mostly with the United States and other powers that the US is allied with today. And the US is allied to Britain and Japan and France and Germany. And people remember that. And it's also many of these hostilities by the US are, of course, also recent. And the other thing I would also claim that may be a bit more controversial, and I think it's hard to prove, but I would claim, and many people believe that these countries would already be more democratic, more liberal, and more prosperous without
Mhm,
these foreign interventions, these constant threats, these economic sanctions, the wars, the meddling in their politics, because that they are constantly under siege. And some of them for like basically the last 200 years, not all the time, but most of the time, too
mhm.
often. And that is not a good environment for democracy, liberalism, prosperity, education, and so on, and healthcare. So, yeah, can you give me your thoughts on this?
Of course. So I can give you some of the data-driven results as well as my own more
Mhm.
theoretical thoughts or case-based thoughts. So our data does show in one of the articles that we published before we published the book, we trace levels of democratization. So the target countries' levels of democratization while the US intervened upon them. And then we also follow the literature to get an idea of whether these kinds of interventions lead to more democratic results or not. And the answer generally seems to say that when US wages the interventions, you generally do not end up with a more democratic society in the aftermath. You end up with more illiberal regimes instead. Not
Mhm.
only that, but broader literature on interventions within civil wars. We generally find that the intervention, even if it's well-intentioned, in most cases seems to extend the civil war.
Mhm.
And in more recent cases of US intervention, let's say Libya, what we ended up seeing is that the US intervened with NATO after
Mhm.
France spearheaded, and it ousted Gaddafi
Mhm.
and left. So it intervened with the sole purpose of overthrowing an unfavorable leader to Western interests, but then it invested absolutely no resources, political will, or time to attempting to bring stability to the region. So that complete lack of power, that lack of stability, that volatile post-intervention arena gave rise to so much blowback that it got the US involved again. So
Mm,
again, the self-fulfilling prophecy, bad intervention outcomes lead to more interventions.
mhm,
And the US administrations, even before Trump, even during Obama, were attempting to leave the Middle East in some
mhm,
way, and they keep getting pulled back in. And part of that is the blowback that prior interventions cause. So I would concur with much of that assessment. Um,
mm.
I will also say that again, I'm not arguing for the dichotomy of the US good or the US bad. I
Right.
do think, for instance, there are certain interventions, and this is something I talk about in my second book, the US's NATO intervention in Kosovo, for instance, the Balkans, that I would argue led to more positive outcomes for the area and for the target country. But even that intervention, while I believe it did hold to more positive outcomes, and was less acute and less ad hoc,
Mhm.
it still created a precedent that other powers are using today.
Right.
So you notice Putin uses the Kosovo precedent over and over and over again against the US and against Ukraine and against the established world order. So even interventions where the outcome is more positive or the initial driving factors don't seem to be as geopolitically motivated, you still end up with this blowback of if you intervene eventually when other countries are powerful enough, they are going to throw that in your face. They're going to say that if you can do it, if you can use these international norms and values to intervene, then we are going to use those same exact norms and values, and we're going to intervene, and you're not going to like it. So
Mhm.
even in the best case scenario, unfortunately, you still have this blowback. Maybe
Right.
not as violent, not as permanent, but definitely blowback that has hindered US foreign policy aspirations and has
Mhm.
contributed to instability in Europe at this moment, for instance.
Yeah, I also noticed reading the book that well, I was thinking like, how many cases are there where you could make the case that this was like a basically a just war, meaning the goals were just and the methods were just. By the
Mhm.
way, that would not include World War II then, because yeah, the goal was
Yeah.
the right one, and I'm glad that the Allies won against
Mhm.
the Nazi regime and against the Japanese. But I mean, the terror bombing and the nuclear bombing of
Mhm.
German and Japanese cities was so horrible that you can't even say like I wouldn't call that a just war, to be honest.
Yes.
Even so, yes, I'm on the side of the Allies, of course.
Mhm.
And also, like, in the few cases where you could say that was probably a good thing the US did, that comes to mind, they
Mhm.
still did a lot of bad things to the country. So that would be, for example, the Panama invasion.
Mhm.
Maybe I think was overall a good thing. I think it's still popular in Panama, but the US has done horrible things. It was basically colonial power in Panama, and you write about Panama in the book. So I
Mhm.
think the overall view of Panamanians of the US, I'm not sure. I've been to other Central American countries, but not to Panama. I think is pretty bad.
Mhm.
Even so, they may say, well, okay, but getting rid of Noriega was a good thing. And similar in Haiti, I think there was
Yeah.
maybe one military intervention in Haiti where Haitians may say like that was a good thing. You helped us instill democracy, but the track record in Haiti of the US and of course of France also is absolutely horrible. The United States has a lot of responsibility for the fact that Haiti is the worst country in Latin America, that it's such a horrible poverty and violence and all that. A lot of that
Mhm.
is the fault of France and the United States. And you also write about that in the book. And
Yeah.
besides of that, actually, where else? I mean, what wars were just? I mean, you could make the case the Korean War had a legitimate goal
Mhm.
of defending South Korea against North Korean aggression, but the terror bombing of North Korean cities was an absolute nightmare. I think they destroyed 90% of their cities.
Yeah.
So, and then what else is there? I don't
Yeah.
know. Um,
Yeah.
but but please
Oh,
let's think a little bit about how and in which way let's try to be fair to the other side. Like, because I still have the feeling that the U.S. empire did some good things for the world too.
Well, I will say, so we do have many data points in the MIP data set where, so if you scroll through and we actually make the case studies available publicly, there are
Hmm.
many instances where the US does use its military force in what we call kind of the provision of public services or public goods as the hegemon. So they
Hmm.
airlift other countries in moments of crisis. So you see a lot
Right.
of this in sub-Saharan Africa. They use their military might to provide airlift to evacuate both either their citizens or foreign nationals from embassies when civil war, civil crisis hits. So
Okay.
these would be cases where the US is using its military force, but it's doing it because other countries are asking. They're saying, we need your help. Something bad has happened here. Help us evacuate our citizens in the aftermath of this crisis. Or the
Hmm.
US offers it directly and voluntarily. And there are also cases where the US comes in the aftermath of a natural disaster and deploys military operations or deploys a Navy ship that is pretty much serves as a hospital across Latin America, for instance. So these
Hmm.
are cases where arguably the hegemon is providing public services to the
Hmm.
neighborhood or to the world. To counter that a little bit, however, so in the case of the Naval Hospital in Latin America, that is generally seen as a humanitarian usage of military resources. But at the
Hmm.
same time, in the political environment of the era, it was also an attempt by the US to use this kind of operation to further influence and control strategic parts. So
Hmm.
I suppose what I'm getting at is that when it comes to a powerful country such as the US or possibly any other country that amasses this amount of power, my follow-up question would be, do we believe it to be realistic for such a country to ever use military force only towards altruistic aims? Or are we really instead expecting this convergence of the country's own interests converge with ethical, normative outcomes. And when
Hmm.
that is the case, perhaps you see some good out of it. But when the interests go against the moral outcome, that's when we
Hmm.
see the frequent messes. And my specialty is the Western Balkans, so I'm going to go back to that as an example.
Hmm.
I mentioned
Please.
Kosovo, but then let's go even before that to Bosnia, right? Where the US was supposed to be the air support for the UN peacekeeping mission there. The UN peacekeeping
Right.
mission was unable and incapable of stopping the Srebrenica genocide in 1995. And part of the reason that they were not able to stop the genocide in 1995 was because of lack of NATO air support.
Hmm.
NATO was called multiple times for air support, and they, I believe, did it very briefly and incoherently once or twice, and then left and never came back.
Hmm.
And then once the genocide had culminated and the horrors had ended, that is when countries such as the US decided to get involved in the aftermath.
Hmm.
And I think many would argue that that mediator role and that militaristic state building role definitely helped Bosnia stabilize, but at the cost of keeping the country so disunited, so frayed that to this very day there are constant daily threats of secessionist movements, of unstable elements that are making that part of the world a central hub for geopolitical tensions.
Hmm.
So I think it's very complicated that even when the US attempts to do good or
Yeah.
attempts to match its own interest to that of the global common good, you have problems because of sometimes lack of political will, or as in the case of Somalia, the US does not like losing its own in humanitarian missions.
Mm.
So the US lost its soldiers in Mogadishu in Somalia in the 90s and arguably decided to not do anything when Rwanda's happened.
Right.
So we have very low political will for throwing in our own resources and our own soldiers into a crisis that doesn't benefit us. So then when we do it, that lack of will, that lack of resources, that lack of dedication makes us very likely to not do it well. So then
Well,
arguably,
if
yeah.
I may comment on these two examples you gave, because I would say it's even worse, because
Mhm.
in Bosnia, I also visited Bosnia, and I would say that the Croatians and the Bosnian Muslims also committed horrible massacres and
They
ethnic
did.
cleansings. I would argue it wasn't, it was at least almost as bad as the Serbian forces. Not much of a difference, and they got the full support of the US and Germany and the West. So much for that. And in Rwanda, the United States, first of all, France supported the genocidaires. Actually, the I've been to Rwanda, and there's still also the victims are still angry that the France supported the genocidal
Mhm.
regime. But the US supported the RPF, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, their
Mhm.
enemies. And I think the latest research shows that I wouldn't say it was the same, but they massacred a lot of innocent Tutsis, I think up to 500,000. So I
Mhm.
would actually say, I know it's very controversial, I think there were two genocides. The most famous ones against the Tutsis was probably the bigger one and the worst of the two, but there was also very genocidal brutalities by the Rwandan
Mhm.
Patriotic Front, which is supported by the United States and Britain. So
Mhm.
even worse than just not intervening in Rwanda, I think they also have a lot of
Yeah.
responsibility for the bloodshed in Rwanda and also in the Congo, because then Rwanda and Uganda intervened in the Congo and they were allies of the US. But
Congo
that's
today, too, for that matter. There's a lot of complicity by Western actors, for sure.
yeah.
I would agree there. And again, the literature generally points to that, that even if you end up winning a civil war or a campaign that has descended into genocide through third-party intervention, what you sometimes get is that the winning party, the winning side that has received the support of the great power, will turn around and commit mass atrocities against the
Mhm.
losers. So
Yeah.
that seems to be a phenomenon that we're well aware of, but we rarely plan for. Then the
Mhm.
question becomes, the US is quite a powerful country, and with power comes, of course, a higher likelihood of using military might, whether for outcomes that turn badly for either the country or the target state, or possibly good outcomes. So I think part of the driving impetus of US foreign policy in the 1990s was the question of what do we do when horrible things happen in the world? And of course,
Mhm.
that was intermingled with how do we use our power to maintain our status, and how do we grow, and how do we get geopolitical goals? So
Mhm.
not to say that that was the only question the US was asking itself, but I believe
Right.
it was one of the questions. What do we do when horrible things happen far outside of our borders?
Yeah.
Especially since part of US soft power at the time was we are the beacons of democracy, we are the protectors of human rights, and we want to spread these values everywhere. So if
Yeah.
we want to maintain that soft policy, then what is the US's role, responsibility when these horrific humanitarian crises happen? And
Mhm.
we have never had a true coherent policy on that, which
Right.
doesn't help at all.
Well, I have to honestly say, because I may have sounded like very anti-American, whatever, I would feel uncomfortable if the US would just completely dismantle its empire and say, like, none of the rest of the world is our business. I would be like, uh-oh,
Mhm.
because there are a lot of bad actors out there. So I'm not sure that would just be a good thing.
Yeah.
But it's certainly much too big, in my opinion. And
Yeah.
also, what was an interesting finding, you compared the how much the US spends on diplomacy. I mean, your proxy would be the Department of State, which is responsible
Yes.
for
Hmm.
diplomacy, as I understand it.
Yes.
And you looked at the percentage they spend on the Department of State compared to the Department of Defense,
Which has
which
changed
is
its name now.
to the Department of War. Well, now it's more honest, actually. I
Yes.
like that change. That's one of the, I
Hmm.
agree with that here on Trump. Um, because that's what it is. But
Hmm.
so, and you show that it has increased from something around 1%, like 150 years ago, to today it's around 5%.
Yeah.
So during all of this time, the US spent at least 20 times as much on military and military interventions and weapons than it spent
Hmm.
on diplomacy. And
Very true.
That is so sad. That's unbelievable. Like we should spend at least half of the money we spend on diplomacy. Come on. How much better would this world be if we would have done that?
Exactly. So that is ultimately the main kind of the main policy prescription of the book, that the
Hmm.
US has really pushed diplomatic tools to the periphery. And
Hmm.
even at its highest, diplomacy was only like 5% of the whole DoD budget. So we have grown our military budget to very, very high proportions relative to any other tools that we have at our disposal to be able to maneuver our interests and to maneuver our place in the world. And exactly how differently would the US behave in foreign policy? How different would things look if diplomacy had greater investments?
Hmm.
And not just monetarily. We are also generally seeing that US executive branches are placing kind of political appointees into ambassadorial roles much more frequently now. So you
Hmm.
end up with diplomats and ambassadors, sure, who are there, but who have very little experience being diplomats and ambassadors, very little understanding of the parts of the world they are placed into. Whereas in the past, the majority of US ambassadors and diplomats were career
Hmm.
diplomats. And they had been in many, many different parts of the world. They generally had strong knowledge of the individuals and the factions there. And they had a genuine interest in learning the languages and in being able to allow for cooperation. So
Hmm.
if you instead now throw in political appointees as ambassadors,
Hmm.
diplomacy shifts as well.
Hmm.
Diplomacy arguably becomes less effective when it's just pure political maneuvering only. Not to say that it hasn't been political maneuvering, but it's not effective if the people on the ground don't know what's happening and may not care to learn.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also wonder sometimes because a lot of this ideology of core narrative of the West that the peaceful democracies are fighting this aggressive authoritarian regimes.
Mhm.
Um, First of all, like if you compare it, like let's say, I mean, Russia has been quite aggressive, especially recently in Ukraine, obviously. But even there, I wouldn't put all the blame on Russia, but a lot of blame on the West too. But that's another and very complicated conversation. But for example, if you look at China, China's last war was against Vietnam in 1974, I believe. And by the
Mhm.
way, the US was on the side of China back then because they wanted to punish the Vietnamese for invading Cambodia, which they invaded because the Khmer Rouge were so horrible, which is actually a good thing. So
Yeah.
even in that war, the United States has some complicity. But since then, China has not invaded any country. And
Mhm.
the biggest threat from China, in my opinion, is that they would go to war to take back Taiwan.
Mhm.
But in their perspective, and they historically, I don't want to get misunderstood because I've been to Taiwan and I love the country and I hope they can keep that status quo that they have, that sort of independence they have.
Mhm.
I hope that for them. But the Chinese have a point. The Taiwan was taken first by Japan and then with the help of the US from the
Yeah.
Chinese nation. So from their perspective, that's not a foreign war. That's an internal issue. And we actually, like the Europe and the United States, actually recognizes that as an internal issue. Officially, we
They
recognize
claim
that
to,
Taiwan
yeah.
is part of China. I
Mhm.
mean, it's a complicated issue, and I'm open-minded what we should do maybe to help Taiwan to sort of defend itself. It's complicated. All I'm saying is it's sort of strange for the United States when they had like almost 400 military interventions and their rate of intervention increased after the
Mhm.
Cold War to then point the finger at China and say, you are so aggressive. And China
Mhm.
could say, like, what are we actually doing?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I think that's one of the biggest concerns in terms of US foreign policy, that how can we critique other countries if we are doing either the same thing or more of the thing.
Mhm.
So we lose that legitimacy, we lose that soft power if we break our own rules of our established international order.
Mhm.
So I would concur in that regard. And then the question we might pose is, are we seeking an international system that's the maintainer of the status quo, or are we more okay to see some revisionism, right? And which path will lead us down a future of more cooperation as opposed to less? And I don't know if I have the answer to that, but in terms of the US and China rivalry, I think that's what it might amount to. And then the question also becomes, should the US continue behaving hawkishly towards China, and to what effect?
Mhm.
What is that going to lead us into? Or
Mhm.
should it step back, allow China to handle its own sphere of influence, if you will, and possibly avoid outright confrontation?
Mhm.
And again, I don't necessarily have a policy prescription there, but I do think that with China's rise into regional hegemony, we most likely, and Monica and I have argued this in another piece in the last year or so, we will see probably lower rates of US military interventions, especially
Right.
those displays of force and the usages of force, because they have a higher consequence now. And
Mhm.
the stakes are higher because a global actor can respond in a way that will hurt us if we go too far. And of
Right.
course, go ahead.
No, it should also be mentioned that the genocide in Gaza also completely destroyed the soft power of the United States around the world and of Germany. Germans are not aware of the fact that the rest of the world has lost respect for Germany completely. They had a lot of respect, not I don't know if a lot, but some respect for Germany and thought like it was maybe a force for good in the world. Not anymore. A lot of people from very different countries all around the world told me I have no respect for Germany anymore after there's like giving weapons to Israel in this. And yeah, so it's also a very completely new situation because of that. We have a multipolar world where the
Mhm.
West is losing power, and at the same time, they are just destroying all their soft power. They don't even seem to realize how the world of the West sees them. And that was also before Gaza to some degree, but now it's like game over when it comes to that.
Yeah, yeah, we definitely saw the trend escalate in terms of loss of soft power after 9/11 for sure, and
Mm,
definitely intensifying now. And then in terms of Germany, yes, many global actors perceive Germany as the fair one because of its restrained kind of usage of force, right? Germany
mm,
was usually the country within the European coalition to say, no, we don't need to intervene here. Let's try to rely on other tools first,
yeah.
which
Most importantly,
actually,
Iraq.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, which was beneficial to perceptions of Western actors
Yes.
globally. So now, with German legitimacy also faltering, the West as a whole is suffering that image decay. And it's a Western world order. So that's a big deal.
Wow. But I also wonder, so you also show there's one important statistic where you show that until the end of the Cold War,
Mhm.
s more than 75% of US interventions were unilateral. The US
Mhm.
acted on its own.
Mhm.
And after that, it got a little better. I think it was 57% or something like that, were unilateral, but still the
Mhm.
majority. So the vast majority of US interventions were unilateral. And
Mhm.
that's another statistical facts that really puts into question whether we could say that the long peace since 1945, which is a great thing, the longest period of peace in the history of mankind. I believe that Steven Pinker and others are correct about that. But
Mhm.
it's not due to the US empire, or at least mostly not. In fact, the US was one of the biggest threats to that peace. But do you have some ideas like what then is the explanation for that long peace? Because that could
So,
also be a way to have some hope here.
yeah. So maybe I'm just throwing some ideas out there, right? So a big change, 1945 onwards, nuclear weapons. So as
Mm,
simple as now you have nuclear weapons, mutually assured destruction. Countries might be militaristic in other ways. They might wage proxy conflicts against each other, but they are pretty rational or have been up until this point, and will
hmm
probably avoid that kind of nuclear escalation. So the existence of nuclear weapons since the 1940s might be a possible explanation for this long peace. Another possible
hmm
explanation that might not be as optimistic is that maybe we're measuring different things. So we're measuring these traditional wars, right? And we're saying that because we haven't had these big, big wars, which are horrendous, that means we are a more peaceful world. But others might argue that maybe we don't have these interstate wars, or hopefully we won't in the foreseeable future either as
Yeah.
much. But we do have a lot of these intrastate wars, these smaller civil wars where third-party actors get drawn into. And those have been extremely frequent, especially since the 1990s, continuing on today. So the type of violence has changed, but
hmm
the violence itself does continue in other ways, and civilian deaths continue to rise because of these civil crises, civil wars,
Right.
and other forms of non-interstate wars.
hmm
So maybe the Great Peace is defined as lack of great power wars. But
Yeah.
but would these other forms of conflict begin to showcase similar humanitarian consequences? Or are we
Well,
just not including them?
Well, I would like to also to mention what most people in the global south actually believe, because
Mhm.
I sometimes ask them and they say, yes, the world has gotten a better place. It's because of decolonization. For them, that's the number one thing that happened in the 20th century, not the world wars and this stuff, even so they suffered a lot from that too, most of them. But they say
Yeah.
like, no, it was because we have more independence. And they often say more independence because they still suffer from the great powers pushing them around.
It's
But
a great
in
point.
other words, I have the feeling that I would put it this way. As horrible as the United States empire was, also after 1945, I think it was a little less bad than the British and the French Empire and the Portuguese and Spanish and Dutch and Belgian empires.
Mhm.
Not so much because the US is in general a better nation or whatever, just because the world has gotten a little bit better place, like a bit more peaceful, and some things just don't we don't do that like that anymore. And so I think that's one of the reasons. And maybe that difference was big enough to give the global south enough room, enough independence to develop, and some of them to develop some democratic governments and so on. So,
Yeah, the US might have been constrained by its own institutions to some degree. And
mhm,
that's actually, that question is one of the reasons we do want to do a comparative data set where we compare other great powers across history to US military interventions to get a better idea of whether the US differs in some way in that regard. But I
uh-huh,
would also say that your claim that I concur with, that decolonization was one of the big reasons, we might also pose the question of where was the world peaceful throughout these decades?
mhm,
Western countries generally benefited from that peace. But if you were to ask an individual from the global south, or even again in the Western Balkans, they would tell
mhm,
you, no, I remember wars in my childhood. I remember
yeah,
wars 20 years ago. I remember wars 3 years ago. We have been in a constant state of conflict for a very, very long time. And we sometimes see drones overhead from
yeah.
Western actors. So who is at peace and who is still in a state of perpetual conflict, I think is an important question to ask. We've
Also,
been,
that's why we call it the Cold War. That's a very
yeah,
Western perspective and maybe Soviet perspective, because for most of the world, it was not a Cold War at all. Ask
mhm,
people in Angola and Nicaragua and Afghanistan, and it wasn't, and Vietnam and Korea, it was not a
mhm.
Cold War. It was a war, and they
War,
died.
war.
So,
Exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. So many of us in the West have been protected from the insecurity, from the wars of these past modern eras, but that doesn't mean that a very large, substantial chunk of the world hasn't been in an active war or war type kind of environment. So I think US or Western hegemony really narrates and frames much of US foreign policy discussions. And
Hmm.
even when I'm not aware of it, I sometimes find myself speaking in those framings. And I think as international relations scholars, many of us are attempting to move away from Western only perspectives, but it is a work in progress.
Hmm. And did I get you right that you have another project comparing the great powers into our
That
history?
is our hope. Yeah. So Monica and I, that has been our aspiration after completing MIP. And we want to compare Britain, we want to compare Russia, we want to compare China and possibly other great powers, either historically or in the contemporary world, to see how they wield military force, either regionally or in their spheres of the world. So we can actually answer that question. How is the US different? If it is different.
Oh wow. I really hope you get the grants for that, the money for that. That would be
That is what we're hoping for too. It's a tough time for academic funding, but we
oh
hope to
yeah.
do this in the future.
Well, I can see that you're excited about that. Uh,
I am because a lot of individuals are very curious about this question, right? How does the US compare to other countries?
yeah.
And we can't answer the question of whether the US is a more peaceful, hegemon relative to other hegemons that have come before it unless we have comparative data. So, as I mentioned earlier, this book mainly compares the US to itself. So, the focus is on, is this good for the US? Is this good for the American people? And then, yes, some discussion of the global stability role. But because it's only in
Mm.
comparison to itself across times, we have to limit the scope of our question. If we have comparative data, we can expand that question and the answer, hopefully.
Well, when it comes to total numbers, I would be excited to have like this competition between Britain and the United States.
Yeah. Yeah. And then
Um,
the objectives and the outcomes are going to be important as well. Again, I want to highlight that while the US has been very interventionist, and that is the big argument of the book, there are data points in there that see the US intervening in support or at the request of other countries as well. So the the dichotomy of whether the US is good or bad, I think is a simple one for most of this. A
mhm.
better discussion, which we've been having, is this in pursuit of narrow interests? How do you define those interests? And when the US pursues these interests, what is the cost to the rest of the world? And possibly what is the cost to the domestic public? And do we want to see
Mhm.
it continue or do we want it to change in some way and why?
Well, I really hope you can do that project. And one reason is because I definitely want to have you back on that.
We are definitely working on it. We're excited, but we've been hoping to do this for a while, and it's simply a matter of time and resources. But that was always the next step.
Wow. Okay. I think I'll let you go. So Sidita, thank you so much for this very informative conversation. I hope people are convinced to get the book.
Hope so too.
Um, yeah, it's we haven't covered all the facts in the book and all the narrative. There's also like a narrative storytelling, like a chronological story about U.S. intervention throughout its history. So it's also an engaging read and not just an academic read. And thank you so much.
Thank you. I truly appreciate your time and your insightful questions. It was a pleasure engaging with you. And if anyone is interested in obtaining the resources that led to the book, you can type in the
Right.
Military Intervention Project and get access to the data and all almost 400 case narratives that go with it that the book is founded upon.
Yeah,
Thank
you
you.
said it before, but there is like one, two, 3 pages for every case study where you can just read it. I looked into it a little bit, and some of the cases I was interested in the most. So that's also a cool thing. And that's how do you get that?
So it is on the Fletcher School website, the Tufts University website. So it's
Mhm.
just called the Military Intervention Fletcher School. I'm also happy to send a link,
Cool. Thank you so much.
of course.
So fingers
Thank you
crossed for
again.
your next project, inshallah.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you again for your time. I really appreciated it.